Good evening, and welcome at the Norton Museum of Art. I'm Ghislain, the Director of CEO of the museum, and I'm delighted to welcome you tonight for this exciting program. It's a program which is offered in conjunction with the special exhibition celebrating the Norton 80 years, organized by one of tonight's panelists, Mary Penny. The special exhibition celebrates some of the highlights of the museum's 8 decades of growth and change. In the 1940s, Ralph and Elizabeth Norton founded the museum with a vision for how their collection might serve this community. And today, as we emerge from a year-long pandemic, I am excited to lead a museum staff eager to serve an evolving community and its new and exciting ways. So please join me in the coming months as we launch exciting exhibition, a summer activity program with community and using the ground around the Norton district, and also hosting blockbuster exhibition in the fall, including Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. But right now it's my privilege to introduce you to the host of this program tonight, my colleague Ellen Roberts, the Harold and Anne Berkley Smith Curator of American Art. Ellen, it's for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ghislain. And welcome to you all. Welcome to Norton from Home and to this panel discussion, Growth and Change, the Norton Museum in Palm Beach County in the 1940s. As Ghislain mentioned, the Norton marked its 80th anniversary on February 8th of this year. And in honor of this occasion, the museum is hosting a special exhibition celebrating the Norton 80 years, which is on view through June 13th. The show features key Norton acquisitions juxtaposed with documents from the museum's archives, offering a glimpse into the institution's history. We hope you will be able to visit this exhibition and participate in forthcoming programs related to our 80th anniversary year. Tonight, we welcome 3 speakers who will each offer a different perspective on our topic. They are each going to speak briefly now, and then the 4 of us will reconvene to discuss the historical context for Ralph Norton's founding of his Norton Gallery and School of Art in 1941, and the institution's first decade in a rapidly changing Palm Beach County. As you'll see, one speaker will address Palm Beach County in the 1940s more generally, and then 2 others will speak about the Norton and another county arts organization, the Society of the 4 Arts, in this same decade. If you have questions, please submit them in the comments field, and we will address them at the end of the program. Our first speaker is Rose Guerrero, who is Research Director at the Historical Society of Palm Beach County. Rose is originally from Miami, Florida, where her love for history was formed. She earned a Bachelor of Arts and Master's degree in Anthropology from Florida Atlantic University. She has worked with several organizations as a preservationist of cultural heritage, co-authored a children's book, The Misadventures of Sandy Trowels, and was an editor for Pace Center for Girls, or educator, for Pace Center for Girls, Broward. Welcome, Rose.
Thank you, Ellen. It's my pleasure to be here this evening. We can put up my first slide. It's my pleasure to discuss the history of Palm Beach County and the Historical Society of Palm Beach County, which was originated and organized in 1937 for the purpose of encouraging interest in the history of Florida and to collect and preserve books and materials connected with the history of the state. During the 1940s, they met and exhibited materials actually at the Society of the 4 Arts. Today, our mission is to collect, preserve, and share the history of Palm Beach County. The Historical Society maintains a very large archive, and in 2008, the creation of the Richard and Pat Johnson Palm Beach County History Museum finally allowed us to preserve and showcase that collection. So next slide, because I want to talk a little bit about what Palm Beach County looked like in the 1940s. But first, we have to go back about 20 years into the 1920s. To give a better historic background and context of these cultural organizations that were formed during that time frame. In the beginning, in the 1920s, which truly, it was the movement from no longer seasonal living in resorts, but into residential areas, which grew from a large housing boom in the beginning of the 1920s and eventually concluded when the boom went bust. Next slide. By the end of the 1920s, when the bubble popped, it was compounded by the devastation of the 1928 hurricane and the financial crisis of the Great Depression for the United States of America. Next slide. The 1930s and the 40s was seen as a time of repurposing, rebuilding, and focusing on community engagement. This is the heart of what was occurring in the 1940s in the county. They were focusing on supporting one another and the efforts of the eventual crisis of World War II. Next slide. In the middle of the 1930s, we see major development of buildings, including in 1936, the new Palm Beach County Airport, which was dedicated as the Morrison Field Airport in honor of Grace Morrison, who led the way to build the airport. By 1941, the United States military established bases throughout Palm Beach County, including at Morrison Field. The temperate climate of Palm Beach County and the flat terrain made it ideal for training pilots and testing airplanes. Next slide. Palm Beach County experienced World War II sooner and at a closer range than most of the United States. Ships traveling in the Gulf Stream were closest to the shore in Palm Beach County, increasing its attraction. Coastal residents had a front row seat to watch ships burn. In response, many who spent the war at home took an active part in defending their shores and supporting visiting military personnel. Next slide. Thousands of servicemen and women spent time in Boca Raton, Jupiter, or the Palm Beaches for the first time because of World War II, and many would eventually return. Next slide. In fact, buildings around the county switched their focus towards supporting the war efforts. In this image, we see the spars during their daily drills at the Biltmore Hotel. Next slide. As well as at the Breakers, which was rented out as a hospital and convalescent home for injured troops. Next slide. Canteens and USO events were held to raise support and the spirit of those training in Palm Beach County before being sent through Morrison Field to the front lines. Next slide. The spirit of Palm Beach County and the community efforts during World War II is what encouraged many to return with their families. When World War II ended, veterans who had trained or passed through Florida during the war fondly remembered the wonderful climate and returned as soon as they could for work, vacations, or retirement. This migration began a new era of development for West Palm Beach and the neighboring communities that continued into the 21st century. Next slide. The 1940 pre-war population of Palm Beach County was nearly 80,000 people, and it would eventually grow to over 115,000 by the 1950s, and it escalated quickly from there on. As you can see, the events in the 1940s spurred the growth of Palm Beach County. I hope this brings into context what our community was experiencing in the 1940s. Thank you. And now I would like to welcome Ellen back.
Thank you, Rose. Fascinating. And now for our next talk, we are going to hear from Marie Penny, who is the guest curator of the Norton Museum's exhibition celebrating the Norton 80 years. Marie graduated from Queens College at the City University of New York with a master's in library science and was previously the director of archives and exhibitions at Richard Meyer and Partners in New York. She also served as the Norton Museum's first archivist, where she established the museum's archives, including 80 years of institutional records. Marie is currently the director of archives at the Preservation Foundation of Palm Beach. Welcome, Marie.
Thank you, Ellen. It's a pleasure to see you. And may I have my first slide, please? So I'm here tonight to speak about the Norton Museum in the 1940s, but I would just like to give a little bit of information about the Preservation Foundation, which was founded in 1980, but it was founded in order to protect historic buildings. And so the mission is to preserve the architectural and cultural heritage of the town of Palm Beach. And it was founded in 1980 when the community needed an advocacy organization to support the awakening historic preservation movement in the town. Next slide, please. The foundation holds several architectural collections, such as the Marion Sims Wyeth collection. And that collection includes drawings of the original Norton Museum, which we see here. And this drawing in particular is very interesting. It's very rough. It's a very rough mock-up sketch, but we see that they filled in the statue of Diana, but left the statue of Actaeon empty. And here I'm showing it contrasted with another example of Wyatt's work, which was also from the 1940s. It was a house that was located on El Vedado Road in Palm Beach, but it was later demolished. Next slide, please. When the Norton Museum opened in 1941, it was the first museum in South Florida. And unlike other seasonal institutions, it was open year-round. And in this aerial image that we see next to the facade, you can see that that Flagler Drive was still a dirt road. In fact, it was a dirt road all the way below Okeechobee. Next slide, please. When the museum opened, there were approximately 100 works of art from Ralph and Elizabeth Norton's personal collection on display. And in this image of the gallery, we see, this was called the American Painting Gallery at the time. And we see a few works such as Robert Henry's Sonny Mac, James Chapin's Ruby Green Singing, and Everett Shin's Concert Stage. And we also see the original bench that was designed by Polly Jessup, her furniture was designed throughout the museum. And now I'd like to switch gears and speak a bit more about the Norton School of Art. Next slide, please. So the Norton provided a valuable cultural resource to the Palm Beaches. It not only brought art to the region, but art education as well. The School of Art also opened in 1941, at the same time as the museum, and it was in operation until 1986. And the school offered classes for adults and children. It included subjects such as watercolor, sculpture, ceramics, painting, and composition. It also offered non-visual classes in Spanish, French, math, public speaking, piano, music history, just to name a few subjects. In this image, we see the influential educator Elia O'Hara's watercolor class in Norton Gallery Park. It's also a great example of how the built environment changed, as we see this large building next to the original Norton that's no longer there. And also this sort of like wild grass in the park, which I think is so interesting that they had the class outside there. May I have the next slide, please? In this image, James Mallory Wilson, another instructor, is teaching a life drawing class in the central courtyard. And the model here poses next to Wheeler Williams' Fountain of Youth. So many of these early classes took place outside. They took advantage of the almost year-round perfect weather. But some of them were indoors in the studio as well, as we see in the image of the sculpture class. Next slide, please. The school also served as a place where World War II servicemen could explore art. In late 1943, the Norton offered painting classes without registration and at half price for enlisted personnel in the armed forces. Groups began coming from Camp Murphy and Morrison Field, which my colleague Rose just mentioned. The museum also kept the doors open on the weekends for servicemen to use the studios and galleries. In November of 1945, the Norton scheduled an all-armed forces exhibition. And Milton Charles won first prize in the watercolor. His self-portrait and some of his sketches are seen here in this article. And I just want to note, because this is interesting, that Milton Charles went on to become the art director at Pocket Books in the 1970s. And he designed the iconic paperback covers for Thomas Pynchon, Kurt Vonnegut, and B.C. Andrews. A bit off topic, but just very interesting to see where some of these artists ended up. This Palm Beach Life article also expands on how the region provided more opportunities for servicemen, including exhibitions also at the Society of the Four Arts and at Worth Avenue Galleries. And after the war, thanks to the Vet Readjustment Act of 1944, many veterans continued to study at the Norton. Next slide, please. In this image from 1952, we see some of the teachers at the time. And from left to right, we see James Mallory Wilson and Willis Woods, who was the director of the museum. And at the time of this image, Willis Wood was granted a leave of absence to return to active duty in Korea. And next is the second director of the school, Eric Lundgren, who previously was the art director at Esquire magazine. Next is Jose DeCreef, who superseded Ann Weaver Norton as the sculpture instructor. And he's best known or one of the works of art that he's well known for is the Alice in Wonderland statue in Central Park. And finally, all the way to the right is Mitchell Jameson, who was the guest watercolor instructor that year. And Jameson was a combat artist during World War II, and he was among the artists commissioned to paint murals for the Department of Interior in Washington, D.C. So the Norton had a group of instructors each year, but also had 2 guest instructors. And so Jameson came back for several years to provide watercolor classes. And so I hope this very brief window into the 1940s, the school, and how it intersected with World War II servicemen has been interesting for you. And I would like to welcome back my esteemed colleague, Ellen Roberts.
Thank you, Marie. And for our final participant tonight is Dr. Philip Rylands, who is President and CEO of the Society of the Four Arts in Palm Beach. Philip has a PhD in art history from Cambridge University in the UK. From 1979 to 2017, he managed and directed the Peggy Guggenheim Collection, Venice, of which he is now Director Emeritus. He has published a number of books and also writes reviews for the Burlington magazine. In December 2019, he was awarded the title Cavaliere all'Ordine di Merito of the Italian Republic. Welcome, Philip.
Thank you, Ellen. And congratulations to Norton, and thanks for inviting me to participate in this. Let's have the first slide. There it is. That's the Society of the Four Arts has this rather literal logo. Founded in 1936 isn't quite accurate, because in 1934, same 3 women, and I'll name them in a second, founded the so-called Civic Arts Association. They then renamed themselves 2 years later, in 1936 precisely, to become the Society of the Four Arts. And the Society, as you can see, is celebrating its 85th birthday, with Trump as a slightly older colleague than the Norton by a mere 5 years. The women who founded the Society, 3 of them, similar to the founding of MoMA in 1929 in New York, were Mrs. Lorenzo R. Woodhouse, Maud Howe Elliott, daughter of Julia Ward Howe, who notoriously wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and Mrs. Frederick Johnson. They started off almost immediately with an art exhibition because Colonel Edward Bradley let them use a storefront on 441 Royal Palm Way. It actually corresponds to the place where the Ravensky administration building of the Four Arts is right now. Let's have a look at the next slide. There, that grandiose quadrangle of a building in white is the Ravensky building, and that's where the first exhibition was. I'll show it to you in a second. Beyond that, moving west, is a low flat building, the O'Keeffe building, where our art exhibitions and our principal auditorium, the Gubelman Auditorium, are. And then in the bottom of the picture, with the red roof, is what we now call the King Library. This was the first seat of the Society of the Four Arts. Next slide, please. But first of all, here on Royal Palm Way was a rather distinguished art exhibition as part of the history of the, we might say, remorse of the Society of the Four Arts, that Rembrandt's Aristotle contemplating the bust of Homer was lent by Lord Duveen to this very early exhibition, brought together from a number of Palm Beach collections by the 2 curators, who were Mrs. Frederick Johnson, whom I've named already, the chair of the art committee, and a certain Daniel McCarthy. So they curated the loans. The Rembrandt was sold many years later to the Metropolitan Museum of Art for $2 million, and there's your remorse. Nonetheless, the Society was not in the business necessarily of collecting art at that time, and probably focused more on its founding than on investing in a collection. Next slide, please. There, look, is what we call the King Library. In 1937, I think particularly Mrs. Woodhouse, but not only, felt very strongly that the Society should have its own seat, its own base. They commissioned from Maurice Fatio this building. It was built rather quickly in 1937, and early in 1938, the Society of the Four Arts moved in, and they immediately had poetry recitals, lectures, musical performances, and they continued to have art exhibitions. Indeed, if we go to the next slide, one of them was the Norton collection, paintings that Ellen will certainly recognize if she can read the names on this list. An exhibition of works of art lent by Ralph Norton and his wife. It's really mainly the kind of Ashcan school 1910s and 20s works of art, which still glory at the Norton Museum today. Robert Henry, John Sloan, and several others. There are watercolors by John Wharf, Frank Benson, and a rather intriguing, sorrowful George Gross, with which certainly our colleagues, the curators, are very familiar with. The collection, this exhibition, and possibly more, was offered at this time to the Society of the Four Arts to own. However, not only was it not really ready institutionally for something as important as this, converting it really into a museum in the Norton name, but also there was the problem of the debt which had been incurred, the mortgage, and the debt which had been incurred for the building of the Fatio's library, which took them a while simply to carry off. So it wasn't the right moment to do this. And of course, the good fortune of Palm Beach and of West Palm Beach is this went on to be a museum in its own right. Next slide. The Society of the Four Arts really comes into its own with a proper venue in which it was able to spread by acquiring at, I believe, half price, thanks to the goodness of Colonel Bradley, what was then called the Embassy Club, right by the bridge of the Royal Park Bridge in the middle of the lake. Addison Meisner had built this in the 1920s, as you'll note from the caption, and it was acquired in 1947, rapidly remodeled by John Volk, and in 1948 the Society moved in, and that still today is where the principal activities of the Society take place, even though since then the original building, now the King Library, has since been restored as a full-blown library. The Ravensky building, the Embassy Apartments as they were then, now has the Children's Library, and there's an education building too. So the expansion has continued from that time, will go on in the future. But that gives you a good impression of how the Society of the Four Arts looked, where its main base of activities looked back in the 1940s. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. And Ellen, back over to you.
Thank you, Philip. Fascinating. And now we're going to welcome our other two panelists back and have a further discussion of these topics. Thank you all. I'm fascinated to see where this discussion goes. I guess I thought I'd start. I want to remind the audience that if you have questions for our panelists, please put them in the comments field and we will attempt to address them at the end of the program. But we'll do a short discussion now between the four of us. I guess I'm wondering, just first off, we've introduced these kind of three institutions that existed in Palm Beach County in this time in the 1940s, the Norton, the Society of the Four Arts, and the Palm Beach County Historical Society of Palm Beach County. How did those institutions change throughout or did you see change in them in that decade? Each of them?
I can leave it to the others since I'm so new to Palm Beach. Here we go.
I think for the Norton, the major change also was Ralph Norton passed away in 1953. So he was sort of approaching the end of his kind of passing along the torch for the Norton. So he was purchasing a lot more artwork in the later 40s after the war, and new director Willis Woods was in place, issuing more programming and more educational initiatives. So I think that they were really also focusing more on the population boom, as Rose mentioned. The more people that were in the Palm Beaches, the more people they had to serve, the more people that enrolled in classes. And it just continued to expand, especially the art collection.
Yeah. Did the school expand too? I mean, the Norton School in those years?
Yeah, they increased their amount of classes, and the student population certainly grew. So some years it was about 200 students were enrolled, and that number continued to fluctuate. And my talk was very brief, but there were so many different instructors and so many different types of classes that were taught there. And each instructor is an artist in their own right and has their own background. Some of their works are even in the collection at the Norton. So there's so much to unpack there too.
Yeah,
the appetite for art must have been very strong at this time, because the Society of the Four Arts was holding art classes at the beginning too.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it closed them down when it realized that the Norton was going to do it much better and much more consistently.
There was a very strong desire for that, it seems. So the Palm Beach Art League, who co-managed the museum, so to speak, like they had their own classes and their own exhibitions before the Norton was built and before the Society of the Four Arts was built. And one of the first exhibitions that they were part of was actually on a showboat, which I thought was so interesting. It's very Florida. But the desire to have a physical building that was theirs and that they didn't have to rent or use a space in a hotel was very strong. So I think when both of those institutions were built, that fulfilled that role.
And Rose, do you have a sense, did your institution, you talked about how Palm Beach County changed so much in the 1940s, but did your institution grow as well?
Absolutely. So the Historical Society actually came out of the Florida Historical Society in the 1930s. There was this great desire to preserve Palm Beach County history. The pioneers of Palm Beach were dying out by the 1930s, 50 plus years since people were coming to the area from the 1870s, so they wanted to save what was left over, save the history of the people that were still around from then. But they didn't have a building. They were traveling a lot from place to place. In the 1940s, we were at the Society of the Four Arts for a good half of that. A lot of the meetings actually were paused during the war because war efforts were more important at that time, mainly focusing on supporting the troops, supporting the community, and making sure the war efforts were successful. Until the 1950s, that's when you see a real big boom just for all cultural organizations, because more people were showing up, but because there was this stagnant years of everyone being weighed down by World War II, people had the desire for culture and for art. So the 1950s was really big for the Historical Society. We had Judge James Knott was our major supporter, who was getting a lot of support from the community. So that was when we moved actually to the Flagler Museum. The Flagler Museum got its support in the 1950s. That's when they started refurbishing Henry Flagler's old White Hall to turn it into a museum.
And are there other arts organizations that existed in Palm Beach County in these years? I mean, besides, I think the Four Arts is kind of the obvious parallel to the Norton from the era, but are there other, or that were founded in these years?
Not so much founded that I've done my research on. There were buildings that eventually became art institutes. For example, the Armory Art Building was a Art Deco armory building built in the 1940s, the end of 1930s for war. So I just see this parallel between art and war, and it's amazing.
Yeah.
I think for other organizations, you have to go out into out into Florida, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah, I note that the Art Education Association was established in South Florida in 1944-46 by a certain Millicent Chamberlain, and there are certainly other sort of statewide organizations that one could identify. It was interesting that Norton was the only museum in Florida at that time.
Yeah.
In South Florida. Yeah. Aside from the Ringling was the other major museum in Florida, but in a completely different region.
Yeah.
And it was the first. And the Morse came not too long later, I believe in the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
The Lowe Museum in the 50s. But the Norton was the first one. Yeah. And the school was something that I believe, it closed in 1986. And so that was also another moment where I think a lot of the arts education transferred to the Armory as well.
And in those early years, Marie, didn't they have at the Norton, there were museum or exhibitions that were traveling around Florida of Florida artists? Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
I remember that correctly?
Yeah, there was a lot of collaboration with other institutions in South Florida and in the South. So they would share exhibitions, and all of the directors of the museums were very close, and they all served as like jurors in other local exhibitions. There was just so much connection. It's so interesting because we hear so much about like, how do we make connections these days? How do we collaborate? But they were doing it back then pretty well without computers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just through letters, right?
Yes, which we thankfully have in the archives, which are great.
Yeah.
From where I come, it's impressive how these are people driven. These are not municipal or governmental organizations. They really grow with the energy and the generosity and the philanthropy of people. It's impressive. Society for Arts really is a society. It's about social relations, really.
And did it change in the course of the 40s in the same way that the Norton did?
Well, it moved very rapidly after the Second World War into its new building, the former Embassy Club, now what we now call the Ravensky building, the big white building on the corner of Royal Park Way. So that was a major step. But the big, sorry, I take it back. I'm referring to the O'Keeffe building.
Right.
We now call the O'Keeffe building the Addison Meisner Embassy Club. Much later, not until the 1990s, comes the Embassy Apartments, converted into the administration building. So I got that backwards. I recently got, thanks to the Historical Society, plans, thank you very much, of the Addison Meisner's original 1920s Embassy Club, complete with swimming pool and dance hall and so on. The swimming pool is literally covered over to enable the auditorium, the Google auditorium where the Tuesday afternoon lectures take place. And that was rather fascinating. Not much survives of that building, but the facade does. And I think 4 of the interior art galleries all go back to the drawings. I know that thanks to the Historical Society.
Did these institutions collaborate then? I mean, because I think we are always looking for ways to collaborate with each other now, but I'm just curious at that time. And I know, there were personal connections between, say, Ralph Norton and Elizabeth Norton. His first wife were on the board of the Four Arts, and they were good. He was good friends with William McKim, who was on the board of the Four Arts. So there definitely are these personal connections. But did the institutions collaborate at that time? I mean, in this era?
I'm not sure. I know that the Society, sorry if I chip in again, the Society for Arts had a very energetic exhibition program in the early years.
Yeah.
Curated shows for Florida artists, curated by people like Alfred Barr and Holmes from the National Gallery of Art and from the Metropolitan and so on. So it was, I think it had an admirable, possibly rather amateurish, but there were different years, it was a different epoch, of course, but their exhibition program was pretty active. And I assume that involved some collaboration with the Norton. As we see,
I think so. I think a bit. I think they're because they're so close, and like you said, Ralph Norton served on the board along with his wife, and also that All Armed Forces exhibition that I spoke about was also the Society of the Four Arts also hosted, and I think that term, like they were inspired also by MoMA's initiative to engage with servicemen. So they also hosted similar exhibits for servicemen at the same time. So I think there was definitely a lot of overlap, certainly.
I assume many of the people were the same, whether trustees or donors or whatever. It was people oriented.
I tried to imagine how they decided, the Norton will have this show and the Four Arts will have this show, and how will that, but maybe they were the same people, so that wasn't as, there was no problem with them kind of clashing with each other or anything like that. That's interesting.
It'd be interesting to put two programs parallel side by side and see whether those overlapped, not just the people.
Well, and it's definitely true that the Norton, as Marie knows, the Norton had shows also drawn from MoMA's collection in those same years. So
in those early years, yeah.
There definitely is interest in modernism at both institutions. Try to see what else I jotted down here.
Yeah, I'm just thinking also about sort of what Mr. Ryland mentioned about the change of the buildings too. So I can't help but listen with my Preservation Foundation ears about that as well, because that is the archives I'm immersed in at the moment. And at the Norton too. So after the school closed in 1986, because I was looking at where those indoor classes were located, a lot of those were removed during the first renovation in the 90s, or repurposed. Some of them, not all of them, were removed. So it's just sharing that point of how interesting it is how the building changes over time to accommodate the different needs of the institution too. And like the Historical Society has moved in so many different locations too.
There's such a direct equation between buildings and owning art and showing art. I mean, have building be able to show art and be able to collect it. And in a parallel way with society, have buildings and be able to organize programs. It's only in recent...
entire campus too, which makes that organization so unique, I think.
We have what you now describe as a campus. And the exponential growth in the number of programs has been a function of having the buildings in which to perform them, to carry them out.
And did the Four Arts, because I think that the history of the Norton in those early years is very much, I mean, there are many people involved, but Ralph Norton was kind of the driving force of this kind of one person. Is that true of the Four Arts in those years, or is it kind of a group of people who are working together to?
It was very collegial indeed. And each person would have had his or her own focus of attention, with a library or music or lectures and whatever. I might have mentioned that in 1938, the alliance, which is still very strong with the wonderful Palm Beach Garden Club, took form of demonstration gardens back in 1938, very same time as the society was moving into the Fatio Library building. The five demonstration gardens were being made by the Garden Club, and those are still there today, of course.
Interesting.
So the society is quite eclectic.
Yeah.
Horticulture.
In so many ways, they're so similar, but also so different, that the two institutions.
Complementary.
And we didn't even touch on all of the performances too. So I think people are often surprised to learn about like the Norton Gallery players and all of the theater performances and opera, ballet even. And that dwindled more in the 1960s. And that was, some speculation is that, it's because entertainment was brought more into the home and people were gradually going out less for these types of events. And also in Palm Beach, the Playhouse opened, and then later, and many years later, the Kravitz Center. So there were other organizations kind of competing for those kind of performance centers. So it's interesting to see now, especially because most museums and cultural organizations now do have a bit of a combination of all of these types of programming, but to see like the roots of that too is interesting.
A successful exhibition has programs around it.
Yeah.
You would know. And Ellen knows exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and it seems like the Norton in those early years and the Norton and the Four Arts combined were trying to fill this gap in Palm Beach County because there weren't a lot of other arts organizations. So it seems like gradually those different functions of the arts kind of spun off and became other institutions. So
seems like it.
Do you all have questions for each other?
I'm delighted to meet you all.
I'm curious for Marie, whether to me, it's very interesting to think about especially the Four Arts in parallel with the Norton. Does this discussion today and just thinking about these issues help you see that early history of the Norton in a different way? Or if not, that's fine too. I'm just curious.
It does definitely, especially because in just a small amount of years before the Norton opened, so much was happening at the Society of the Four Arts. And when I was also researching what schools or classes were available before the Norton, it was primarily at the Society of the Four Arts, outside of like standard schools and like WPA instructors and that type of thing. I think also, I'm going to hold that thought. Okay.
I see that we have one question in the comments, so I will ask that. One of our members has asked, what is the Morse Museum? Because Marie, I think you mentioned the Morse Museum.
Yes, and I think I incorrectly said that when that was founded. That was actually founded around the same time as the Norton, but that's in North Central Florida. So the Henry Morse Museum. I believe it's the museum that has the large collection of Tiffany glass.
It does, yeah.
Right. And that's sort of near Orlando, I would say, but not quite in that central Florida area.
Another very different Florida collection.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone else have questions for our panels? I'm looking at our comments field here.
What if anybody knows how many museums there are in Miami?
Oh.
Good question. And it's interesting that none of them are from this era, I don't think. Are they?
Not quite. The Lowe Museum, I believe, was founded not long after the Norton, but some of those are associated with a university collection. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like that's
my history in Miami. I'm trying to pull from the.
Oh, that's right.
Not much on my brain there.
And only recently, Palm Beach has become the hub of contemporary art in the United States.
That's right.
With collectors and galleries and so on. Exciting, all that.
Oh,
Ralph,
I remember what I wanted to say. Just about how the Norton was potentially going to bring their collection to the Society of the Four Arts, and also to other institutions where they were kind of shopping around, so to speak. So I think that part of the story is so interesting.
If you don't have that hand list, which was printed on the occasion of the show, then I'll get a copy to you.
Yeah, we have that, which is very interesting. And also what's interesting is that I think, as you rightly pointed out, that collection is so kind of Ashcan focused and kind of American realism. And then their collection changed so much in the course of the 1940s after they founded the museum. So, so it's just interesting to see how it evolved as Ralph Norton's taste changed, I think, but also as he was collecting for an institution and not just for himself.
I think you'll find there's a huge overlap with the artists who exhibited in the American Pavilion of the Venice Biennale. That's something I looked into when I was there a good deal. In fact, I wrote a short history of the American Pavilion of the Venice Biennale.
Interesting.
And the pavilion was built in 1930, run by the Grand Central Galleries in New York. But the artists that are in the checklist of the Norton show, they all appeared at one time or another in the American Pavilion.
Huh.
Which isn't difficult because they would put up shows with 200 or 300 works of art. They possibly would cover every inch of the walls, not like today.
It's a different kind of aesthetic they had then. Well, I guess we have no further questions from the audience. So I want to thank our panelists for joining us this evening. Rose, thank you so much for your insights into the development of Palm Beach County, especially the importance of the war in this period. And Philip, thanks so much for your insights into the development of the Norton's sister institution, the Four Arts. And Marie, thank you so much for all your work on this wonderful show, and especially for founding our archives, which we never had till Marie came to be our archivist. So
thank you.
I had the pleasure to work with Marie when she was at the Norton, and we have a much better sense of our history thanks to her now. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I want to just tell you a little bit about our programming for next week. On next Thursday evening, April 22nd at 6 p.m., my colleague Lori Barnes, the Norton's Elizabeth B. McGraw Curator of Chinese Art, will present a curator's conversation addressing an extraordinary Chinese painting currently on loan to the museum in her talk entitled Kings of Birds in Chinese Art, the Phoenix and Birds of Prey. You can register for this free program online at norton.org, and we look forward to seeing you there. Until then, we wish you well, and thank you for joining Norton from Home.